This first lecture on intercultural transitions is going to cover migration. Now, most of the time when we think of migration, we only think of people moving from one country to another. But we also might want to think about migration in terms of people moving from one cultural space to another cultural space. We might think of somebody who is moving from one city to another city within the same country as going through a certain kind of migration or migratory practice, even if they're not necessarily moving between nations, because the culture they're moving into could be very, very different. The forces of migration that we want to consider are the push-pull perspective, which is usually done at a policy level, and then voluntary and involuntary, which we're looking at more at the personal level or sometimes at a cultural level. The push-pull perspective is an idea that push is something that sends people out. We think about a social or economic or political force that might push somebody out of a particular cultural space. Pull is what attracts people to a spot. So someone might choose to migrate to a certain place because it has better economic opportunities. It provides safety, or maybe they're attracted to family members who might live in that new place. There's an idea of voluntary and involuntary forces in migration. Basically, this idea is that some people choose to migrate somewhere else. They elect to go to a different spot, and then other people are forced to migrate somewhere else. These can be related to a push-pull perspective, but to some degree, voluntary and involuntary is about the individual's agency, whereas push and pull is put in different terms. Another thing to consider is the duration of migration. The duration of migration is either short-term or long-term. So for example, travelers, people going on a trip, tend to be short-term voluntary migrants. They're going to a space for a short period of time, and generally they're choosing to go there. Some refugees are short-term involuntary migrants. A short-term involuntary migrant, or this type of refugee, is somebody who's planning to be resettled or return to their home culture or their home country. Long-term is basically people wanted to be in a space for a long period of time. Immigrants, in this particular definition, are long-term and voluntary. These are people who are planning to settle in a new place, perhaps permanently. Some refugees are long-term involuntary migrants. These are people who might have challenges being resettled into a new nation, into a new culture, or into a new space. They would prefer not to be in that cultural space, but they can't choose to leave the new cultural space. So in many cases, they're put there against their will. Some of the applications in considering the ideas of these forces of immigration, when we look at push-pull, it helps us consider forces that drive migration among large groups. Again, this is considered often from a policy perspective rather than an interpersonal perspective, but it's important to acknowledge that. Combining forces with duration helps us consider political, economic, and social forces around migration. In many cases, we might think of migrants as simply having choice, but we want to recognize that other forces can be at play. And lastly, understanding motivations help us understand cultural transitions. It helps us understand how adaptation and cultural adjustment might work. And this is important to consider when we're looking at how someone adapts or changes, not simply that they do. So in summary, we want to think about force and duration to help us understand and categorize reasons for migration. We often want to think of these as dialectics rather than dichotomies. In other words, we might want to think of some of these forces as in tension with each other, not necessarily as one or the other, and in many cases we get a range of them. These types of ideas are often good for understanding large groups and getting some generalizations, but they're not always good for individuals. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging individual differences and not just assuming based on large groups.